I'm delighted to be here this evening, and hopefully we'll get Aileen, you keep the technology going there. So I'm speaking about the parish of Broadford, which I spoke to the group before, and I don't want to be, we'll say, duplicating everything that I said previously. Inevitably, there'll be a certain amount of the same. But I'm hoping this evening maybe to concentrate a little bit on the sources of local history, that maybe for people here who are doing research themselves, that I might have a few pinpointers that I picked up over my decades of research that might be helpful to others. Firstly, we'll go through a number of slides and views, and we'll stop occasionally, and I suppose we'll take questions at the end rather than during the presentation. So Broadford is an amalgamation of two civil parishes, the parishes of Kilsylie and Kilakennedy. Broadford is a modern construct, really, early part of the 19th century, where you had the amalgamation of the two, the Catholic Church was formed through the amalgamation of the two medieval parishes. Kilsylie is the Broadford end, Kilakennedy is the upper end, the Numera Valley, Kilban. The view you're looking at there is looking, Broadford village is just down in the valley. Broadford Valley comprises of a lot of drumlins. It's a remnant of an Ice Age movement. It's and we're looking out towards the Fergus. So we are looking east in that picture there. And all I'm saying is, when you look at that landscape today, you're looking at farmland, occasional houses on the hillside, and most settlement is on the valley floor. So when you're traveling today through Broadford, let's say through to O'Brien's Bridge on towards Killaloe, you're traveling in the valley. But just to say that in the time period that I was researching, or I researched the early part of the 19th century, that parish that today contains maybe something like 1,000 people, at that time contained 8,200 people in the year 1841. And I know you're a genealogical society and you love doing family research, so do I. But the problem you will hit in a parish like Broadford is that of those 8,000 people, the vast majority of them, their names were never actually written down. You know, it's rather sad. I started in the period 1800. And the reason I started at that period, because in the 50 years from 1800 to 1850, that was a period of enormous change. You go back to 1800, Broadford was self-policing, really. You had no police force. And when there was occasional significant events of disorder, it meant the British Army, the English Army marched out from Limerick to control same. In that 50 years, 3 barracks were opened then, and we'll come to that later, in the parish itself. No school recorded in the year 1800. Then we got the initial head schools and local schools in townlands like Fermyle, Ballykelly, and in the villages of Broadford and Kilban. By the year 1800, we had 3 national schools, actually 5, but really I'd say 3, because Broadford was Broadford Boys and Broadford Girls in adjoining buildings, and similarly with Kilban, Kilban Boys and Kilban Girls. And a fascinating school in the townland of Woodfield, set up by a Protestant landlady. Her maiden name was Strong, S-T-R-O-N-G-E, from Narrawater in Northern Ireland, and she was married to one of the O'Briens from Drumoland, one of the offshoot, O'Briens. She was Anne O'Brien, and she founded 3 national schools, one in the parish of Broadford. She insisted on they being non-denominational. That, of course, ran into immediate controversy, because the local parish priest didn't like to hear that terrible word non-denominational back in the 1840s. That school only lasted whilst she was in a position to fund it. So we have 3 barracks, 3 schools. 1800, we had no Catholic church in the parish. By 1850, we had 2 of the largest parish churches, and again, we'll have views of those later, 2 of the largest parish churches in the diocese. And also the smallest church, a church of ease, called Kilmore as well. So we had no post office. The post office came. We had no poor law came. So all of the road network, huge amount of the modernization that you will still find in the parish today took place in that period, 1800 to 1850. It also came with the decimation of the famine, which is not something I'm going to touch on, but it's not something I'm really going to cover this evening. So that's a nice topographical view, and that's another view from the hillside looking back towards Glenomra Valley. And I don't know whether the cursor is visible there or not, but just to say, you're looking back there in the direction of Kilrush. And on the hillside there, there was the Gap Road, because if you go back into early history, most of that valley was flooded. I sometimes think that maybe if we have this new idea of rewilding, that maybe, I hope there's no local farmers watching this Zoom presentation that won't be too happy with my, maybe my proposal, but much of the valley previously was flooded. And occupation in prehistory was very much on the hillsides. To my right, there you have Fermyle. And on top of Fermyle Hill, there's one of the largest forts, equally big, as big as Mohan, only identified in the last 20 years through aerial photography, which shows that, I suppose, discoveries are continually being made. And just to say, and the hillsides there that you're looking at, there are individual townlands that today might only have a population of 10, 20, 30 people, like Cloney-Conray, not Cloney-Conray, Clongaheen, which in 1841 had 940 people living there in 103 houses. And now sometimes the council, I'm not blaming the council, but they'll complain about over density. And yet there was in one single townland, there's almost very few people living there today with a population in one single townland of over 900 people. And again, the townlands, the fascinating names, Ardskey, Knockshanvo, which is the hill of the big cow, mythical tale. You have, so I could be listing them for a while, but I'll move on. Broadford on the hillside has a lovely range of megalithic tombs. And again, because the valley floor was flooded and they were a pastoral people, most of their activities were on the hillside. And right throughout Broadford, you have a whole series of dolmens, Diarmaid and Grania's bed, megalithic tombs, whatever term you want to use. And they have been well tracked by Borlasse, by Westrop, by De Valera and Anoulan. And many of them are well worth the exploration. You walk through them and suddenly you're looking down onto Doon Lake like you are there, which is almost is magical, I think. Again, that's a different one, left there by the farming, pastoral farming going on all around them, but farmers aware of them, aware of their existence and delighted to have them. And I think there's a lovely naturalness about the positioning of them. We're not claiming to be Pound and Brown. You're not Coraldine. There are not huge signs showing you where one is. It's a matter of getting your ordnance survey map and exploring. And I think that was one great thing about COVID, that period, where an awful lot of young people in the parish of Broadford, and not so young, including myself, went on treks, young and old, to explore many of those places. And that's, for instance, that's my grandchildren, and that's just an example, and my daughter-in-law exploring, will say, those dolmens. The only question I had about that particular photograph was I was trying to work out this evening, was she wearing the Broadford All-Ahan jersey, or is it a Limerick jersey? Because she's a proud native of County Limerick. And now we're back into Broadford, photograph taken in the 1950s. Broadford village was exceptionally well located. If I might just go back just a small bit now. Sorry, just that's the first map. That's what I meant to start with. If you look there, an 18th century map of County Clare, there's only a few. Look at East Clare, there was only a few settlements mapped. And if you find Tulla there, Tulla to Broadford, on to Kilrush. So if you were traveling from Ennis to Dublin, your route took you through Tulla on through Broadford, the Gap. The mountain range is called the Shlibannock, the mountains of the gaps. So the first gap was the one taking you through Broadford onto O'Brien's Bridge. So Broadford was a very important settlement. And if you were coming from Fecal, which is marked there, northeast Clare, up near the lake, Loch Graney, and you were going to Limerick, you were going south into Broadford and on through the gap out onto Limerick. So Broadford was given a charter 1627. It's all land, the Broad Ford, the crossing of the Orgarney River. And the Orgarney River, okay, it carried the same amount of water in the 1840s as it does today, but it was it fed into a much more extensive lake. There was a drainage system carried out in the post-famine period called the 6 Mile Bridge Drainage Scheme, and that lowered the level of Doon Lake and all of the river out as far as Bunratty. So Broadford, which was virtually on Doon Lake, is now a mile further east, if you understand what I'm saying. That's from Taylor Skinner's map, 1787. And it's showing you're coming out from Limerick. Again, you can see the outline of the hills, and you can see the gaps in the mountains. The main line route coming from Limerick towards Galway, okay, you had the route through 6 Mile Bridge and you had the route through Broadford. So what I'm saying is that the village had a far greater importance in the 19th century than it had today. It reminds me a little bit of Castleconnell. You know, villages that were, now Castleconnell is still a lovely village, Broadford is still a lovely place, but certain villages go through cycles and new villages and towns are developed. So Broadford then would have been one that would have been maybe a little left behind over the centuries, and it's only in modern times people are aware of its proximity to Ennis, Shannon, particularly Limerick, that new development is now taking place. So that is a photograph of the village in the 1950s, the building at the very top, looking down, were the MacDonalds, who were the great merchants of Broadford. The MacDonald family intermarried with some of the great Catholic merchant and landed families of the county. They weren't at the part of the landed grouping. They were part of that merchant and very big, large farming. So they had a huge farm, they had a road building concern, and they were very much into their horses and stock. They had their winterage in the Burren and so on. They would be a little bit comparable, I think, with the White family of Tulla and so on. You know, families that you had in large towns, well off and given wonderful employment. And if you were to look at the village today, there was that row of houses on the right-hand side, they are long since gone. And again, it's the informality of the time, the poor condition maybe of the road, bicycles just abandoned, no question that they were going to be lifted. That is an extract from the Ordnance Survey map, and I just want to thank my son Aidan, who's here with me this evening, for preparing the slideshow for me. And just on the bottom left, you'll see Huddlestown, the domain of the Bentley family, and at the top right, but not included, sorry, the middle, top middle would have been the Goings. They were the two great landed families of Broadford village, the Bentley family and the Going family. And the police barrack is there, where the school is today, Fair Green, Pound, the Church of Ireland building, and so on. So that is the village in the 19th century. And again, there's a whole network of lovely roads around Broadford, laid out by the English government in the 19th century, I suppose, to control the territory as much as anything else. And the great advantage of that is that you can walk on tarred or on good roadways right onto the hills. And that's the best views you'll get in East Clare. It's not so much traveling through the village, but rather climbing, getting your Ordnance Survey map and going up onto the hills. And the great thing about that then is you're coming across the cowl, as my father would have called it, the ruins of the house, of the houses where people lived, worked, and most would have long since immigrated to those families. So that's why, even since people heard about I bringing out the book after a short interval of 40 years working on it. I was going to say I do volume 2 as well, but I'd need to live to be as old as Methuselah to manage, I think, a volume 2. But all these queries start coming in once the word gets into the champion. Somebody in people I hadn't heard of in South America and places like that that could trace their ancestry back to Broadford parish. So again, I'm just showing those as examples of what people will find, where a family once lived and more than likely undocumented except within the folklore and folk knowledge of the people. And I remember speaking to an elderly person a number of years ago, and they could attribute ownership to many of the houses. Carty, Harkin, names, Guttery, names that I had never heard of in the village. It was only through the last number of years, some of those surnames have surfaced in various records. So that's again, the remnants of the cowl of the house almost blended into nature on the hill of Arskey, and very, going to be within, maybe that was taken 20 years ago. I cannot say, is it now demolished, overgrown with firs or whatever. Again, formerly a farmhouse, born, then used as, we'll say just as an outbuilding. My father was born when there was a farm there in 1920, and the current owner, my first cousin, is in the process of now doing it, which is the great thing about maintaining the structures, because it gives us a chance to restore them. In Broadford, on the hillside, you'll still find, you can take photographs like this and the following one. They were remnants of the lazy beds, where the people farmed, put down their ridges and grew their potatoes. So that field has never been touched with the Hymac yet. And the moment it is, that it's in its own way, it's the glory of something. And it's only at particular moments, maybe in a frosty morning or a morning when you have a lot of dew, and you look onto the hillside and you can see those ridges are not apparent once the sun burns off the dew. So again, praising Aidan, he will know what happens because he doesn't get that much often. Aidan prepared that slide for me. It's on all the parishes of Clare, and I'm sure he'll share it with you. The two red lines, Kilsylie and Kilkennedy, that during the famine time, their loss was close to 50% of the population. Gone. Ruthless. Now, again, a feature of Broadford, now a feature, once a feature of industry. The big connection with Broadford back in the 19th century was the slate quarries. And again, now I'm sure as you begin to get familiarize yourself with the photograph, you can see the gray mounds begin to appear in the landscape. And again, there's something you might never notice as you drive through the village. They're on both sides as you enter Broadford from the Tulla side. A whole series of family-run slate quarries that really never turned out to be very economical because they were run by families, Dial, Savage, Ryans, and the names denoted that they are supposed to have come across the River Shannon from working similar veins on the Tipperary side. And of course, as family-run operations, when they went down a certain depth, the water came in, and they didn't or could not afford the pumping equipment, so they left. And so then there's an example where the workers were lowered down the sides on a little seat to chisel out the slate. So you're walking, you see the mound, you explore it, and suddenly you're finding this inside. So these are all photographs. That's one again, just sitting there in the landscape. That's a ribbage mound or a heap of discarded slate. Further amount of discarded slate has now been used by farmers, remove some for the making of a road. That is a photograph of an original slate that was on Doon House. And if you look at the ruler, it's showing you a measurement of 30 centimeters. So that was an enormous slate. It was, I think it was a duchess, they called it. They had particular sizes for the slates. So that slate is the size, I suppose, of 3 foot high slate. Again, just a feature of the landscape where people used for their fences, for the ditches, they used the discarded slate. And again, isn't that a feature worth preserving? And the great thing about, we'll say, the childhood that people have, a school time now, maybe compared to years ago, This is the local 4th, 5th and 6th class children exploring Crohan Hill. So their knowledge, their level of knowledge will be greater than what we had as young people, because there's so much more information available. Again, this is Derra Mills, and Derra Mills is sitting on the Organy River. It was one of a series of water-powered mills. It was a fine corn mill, abandoned for over maybe 150 years, but thankfully still sitting there at the corner of the field. And there are features from photographs taken of features within it. You can see part of the old timber mill wheel and the lovely artwork. That was part of a farming family. That was a mortar, I think, for grinding herbs. A blunderbuss found in the 1830s in a very active period in the parish, active in terms of the tide war and so on, and lawlessness. There was a rushlight used for lighting. And then occasionally in the landscape, you come across a little feature like this, which is like an old Famine road leading into what was a cluster of houses in Knockshenvo. Now, the earliest Christian settlement in Broadford, parish Kilsylie, sorry, not the earliest, apologies, this is quite, but one that's very difficult to locate is the Mass Rock in Huddlestown. And this is a place that was of huge importance during the penal period, because situated right on the top of Huddlestown, where people had a view, especially towards Limerick, when the redcoats of the military, if they were coming, and people could scatter very fast. And the story is that the priest tied the horses using the recess on the stone on the right. Now, again, difficult to locate now, again, during COVID. Myself and my niece, Clina, we made a few efforts to find it. We found a number of rocks, photographed each particular one, to be told by the local person in Kilsylie, wrong one, face up the hill again. I don't know whether he was just being vindictive or not, but finally we pinned this one down, and my nephew did. Drawing of the Church of Ireland building in Broadford, a huge loss, demolished in the 1960s, stupidly or carelessly, I suppose. We weren't aware of just the rich architectural heritage that we had. There's a photograph of it, a unique photograph of the Church of Ireland building, because it was a small community, very active, very much built around the goings and the butlers of Doon House and the Bentleys of Huddlestown. And as I say, that was demolished. The graveyard attached to it is still there. It's at the end. I don't know if any of you ever been in Broadford hurling field, the Number Park, lovely hurling field, but there's an embankment free. All the locals seem to find it, especially if there's a €10 charge, the gate or whatever, you'll find people standing on it. It's just outside the perimeter of the Church of Ireland. And there's still a nice, very small graveyard there. That was one of the Board of First Fruits. And what a lovely building. Pity it's gone now. And for those of you into your cars, your vehicles, which I'm not, maybe you'll know who used to drive the ambulance, IE 4704. And in the background, immediately with the two bikes left, that was the Black Horse Inn. They had a tannery attached. They were the Murnans. They were connected with the McNamara's of Ennis. They were merchants. Their business declined. They're long since gone. And the building is demolished. And you see when the church was built in the 1830s, they wanted to make the statement. All they had prior to that was a chapel in the chapel field in Arskey, and now suddenly the Catholics have got their Catholic emancipation, and this is the first. They built two parish churches equally. Well, of course, it was catering for a population of 8,000 people. They built two huge parish churches on the hillside. And if you just look at the pinnacles, 4 pinnacles, you'll notice that when it was remodeled between the 1950s and the 1990s, they have been removed. And there is St. Peter, sort of the patron saint of Broadford, minding us all. That's him there with the keys, supposedly came from an older church site. Other people say it was more modern than medieval, but regardless, he would be like almost an icon, I suppose, of the parish. That's the companion church built in Kilbane, and it, because of the loss of the priests in the last number of years, it is thankfully now being run for art, drama, different activities by the locals in Kilbane. And they're making a wonderful, wonderful job of it. And it's, again, they have lovely murals and artwork on the walls and so on. If you find yourself in Kilbane, it's well worth calling in to take a look. So they haven't let the church die. That is an interior view of Kilbane. And just go back there a moment now. And okay. On the hills, this Kilbane church replaced Kilkennedy. There were the two medieval churches, was Kilsily and Kilkennedy. And in Kilkennedy, on the side of the hill overlooking Kilbane, is one of those, I'm sure most parishes have them, the site of the old medieval church. And it has an important number of tombs. It was cleaned about 20 years ago. These photographs were taken at that particular period. If you looked at it today, it's probably overgrown again. So again, you can see the magnificent view. A famous penal priest, Father Dugan, is buried there. A lot of later priests who served in the gunning priests, and others who served in Scotland and elsewhere are there as well. But most especially when it was cleared underneath the ground, just about maybe 3 or 4 inches down, was a magnificent series of horizontal slabs. And these were never seen and haven't been seen since, really, only when I photographed those, because as soon as they're left, the grass returns, and within, it's amazingly how quick that they're lost again. But the only advantage about them being lost is that when they were cleared, they were like as if they had been sculpted or carved the previous week. And there on the left, you'll see Michael Hogan, who died in 1793, aged 17 years. Now, they're all carved in Broadford slate. So the people who could afford to carve those were the better off farmers. And I suppose that and on the next side is Joanna Hayes, in memory of, is Thomas, I think. His wife, Joanna Hayes, alias Crow, who departed this life January 1819, aged 33. So you had a whole series of these grave slabs lying there through the centuries. Then we're back to the Broadford end, and this is Kilsily church site. And within it, you find a vault to the Bintley family of Huddlestown. And an even earlier one, sorry, we have it there actually, on the right-hand side, there is a fabulous slab put together in a whole series of early medieval pieces to the Bridgemans. The Bridgemans were a family that were in Broadford in the 17th century. They built Woodfield House, and they were connected with Rathluby and so on. And they were a family of importance, and they have their beautiful head and the sculpted pieces all put together in a monument built into the wall. Somebody said that they have Masonic symbols and so on within them. I am not sure. Again, I think a fabulous emblem for the parish. Smallest church in the diocese then is Kilmore, on the road from Broadford to Limerick. My wife's area, so I better mention this one and praise it and say how wonderfully they too are keeping it. It was called the Church of Ease. And that meant that for the people in that area in the 1820s, when it was built, they didn't have to walk to Kilbane. Instead, they had the local church. The bell dated 1836. Waterfront. Now, the parish has a whole series, naturally, of holy wells, as again, most rural parishes have. And even though I'm using this one, because it probably is the most photogenic, it's actually the least authentic in one way, because this was remodeled in the 1920s by people who loved the holy well and decided that it should be restored nicely. Most of the other wells, the holy wells, are really only wells where the water breaks out of the ground. And I was just going to list those for a moment, just keeping in mind that that's Ballyquin well again, well enough the fields, well enough the road, sorry, in the fields. Now, and I thought the holy wells were hugely important in parishes like Broadford before the churches were built. This is where the people went. This is where the religion was based. And I actually think it myself, the more I think about it and see religion practiced over the years, Irish religion is a huge element of supernatural in it. I'm not sure I'd be great in theology. I'm not saying, oh, you people might be, but a lot of people are just interested. Religion was, I think, our religion had a huge element of supernatural in it. And you can see where it came from, because a description of a holy well in the early part of the 19th century was in Clare, where whiskey, porter, bread and salmon were sold in booths and tents. According to Croker, every tent had its piper and 2 or 3 young men and women dancing the jig. Later in the night, the effects of the circulation of port and whiskey amongst the various groups became evident. Songs were sung. Rebellious songs in the Irish language were loudly vociferated. But the dancing, drinking, roaring and singing continued to some degree throughout the night. So no great surprise that the holy wells were so popular. So in Broadford, you had since Berryquin Well, Tubber Sheila, McCullough's Well in Gurtnagluck and Tubber Cronan. And in that well, it was divided into 8 special little categories or cells or sections, and each section had a cure for a different ailment in the body. Again, we're back to Broadford, McDonald's, and just to say that in the 19th century, I think I mentioned that, it was mentioned in the Clare Champion, Broadford was an important post office. The mail came out from Limerick City every morning. It was left in Broadford, and from there, a man on horseback took it on towards Fecal, Bodyke, etc. The carriage, and this is by Coney one, he served Broadford, went further on to Tulla, and then came back from Tulla through Broadford back to Limerick. So a person could travel to the city each and every day. Only the wealthy, of course. Again, that is McDonald's, and just I'm going to mention sources as I go along, and these are private sources. The accounts book was loaned to me by the man who recently, James, my brother, who owned McDonald's, and you find within that was an account when there was the RIC, there was an agrarian outbreak, disorder in Ballykelly in 1919. The RIC had a substation there, and these are the supplies that they were purchasing. That was formerly a barrack, demolished by the family a number of years ago. It was a barrack that was covering the Broadford Limerick Road. That was a wildish, inaccessible terrain, and they were afraid, of course, of robberies on the road. That again is a further view of it, and it really again is a reminder of the loss of the buildings that we've suffered. One of my favorite photographs, because as one of my family titled it, Church and State. There was the barrack there on the left, there's St. Peter on the left, the 2 institutions that kept a sharp eye on activities in the parish. That is Broadford Barrack today, which was always a very important constabulary barrack, because it was large, it was on an important junction. And for instance, when the War of Independence took place and all the subsidiary barracks in Bodyke, Fecal, and so on were closed down, there was a line of barracks kept open going from Killush, O'Brien's Bridge, Broadford, 6 Mile Bridge, Tulla. They were the ones where there were so many soldiers stationed that they actually had to requisition gentry houses in the locality, because it was a centre. Kilban Barrack still occupied, thankfully, as a residence. Again, I'm mentioning sources, so if that is the estimate for the cost of building Kilban Barrack in the 1840s. I did a lot of research on the crime records in Dublin. I think if you have time ever, there's a fantastic amount of papers available in Dublin. They were formerly in Dublin Castle that are now in the National Archives. So because we had 3 barracks and the English were very bureaucratic people, there was a huge amount of reports always working their way back to Dublin. And some of those were quite informative, not about who did what. But I remember in one incident, there was a man who suffered a head wound, and the police report detailed how he had received medical care from his neighbor who was good, who was handy with head wounds. Now, whatever they might say about the hospital care, I think I prefer to take my chances with that than the neighbor with handy with. Another area that I have used hugely, and again, I don't know how much use you have made of them, is newspaper extracts. Now, not many newspapers would have been sold each week in Broadford. Only very few people at that stage were reading newspapers, but the Limerick Journal and the Clare Chronicle, Limerick Chronicle and the Clare Journal were issued each week, and most of them are now microfilmed, searchable, and there's a lot of genealogical information within them. That was a later barrack that was demolished. So some of the houses, and you might be interested in some of the families associated. There was Violet Hill House, a beautiful location. Violet Hill looking out over Doon Lake. That belonged to the Going family. And the Goings were in Broadford from 1780 to 1812. And then they finally left to the local refrain of going, gone. And they were a great family to the extent that they did most local improvements involved members of that family. And one of the most magnificent documents that I've ever copied or worked from was compiled by a member of that family, Mary Going. Mary Going was a member of the Going family. She wrote a journal in the 1840s. It was given, I think, to the county archives. They had difficulty in locating it. I presume it's been found since, but luckily a person that's here this evening, Declan Barden, had done a transcript of it, and which he loaned me. And working from that, it was an amazing account of a woman's life in the mid 19th century, because it's very hard to get accounts of what life was like for women. Now, accepting that she was at a remove from most of the local women. And she was an evangelical Church of Ireland person. She documented every sermon, what the preacher said. She was very highly religious. When her brother spoke about going to the races in Tulla, and then you're hearing about the steeplechases in Tulla incidentally through that mention. She's complaining that they're not thinking of the human race and the need for prayer. They still went to the races the following day. She details how there was a cricket matches played in Violet Hill in the 1840s. Whether we brought the same level of anxiety, of energy to our cricket matches as we did to the hurling matches, I am not quite so sure. But so it's just fascinating to have a document, as I say, written by, written by a member of, by a female, a member of the Church of Ireland family, the Goings. And her labor of love was the opening of a scriptural school in Violet Hill. She raised money. She was constantly making handicraft purses, different objects, and selling them, and used the money to open a school in Violet Hill. The school again ran into the problem of non-denominational education, and it didn't last very long because the priest wasn't happy with it. Woodfield House, one of the most historic houses in the parish, and just to show you what the power of money can do, same house. So a very historic house associated with Charles Walker of Limerick Lace and many, many other families. At the very start, it was the Bridgemans, then it was Locke, L-O-C-K-E, Griffin, the father of Gerald Griffin, the novelist, and other families right through until modern times when it has been restored. And that's the location of it, down there close to Doon Lake. Part of the series of 5 or 6 original 1840 watercolors gives us our only depiction of Doon House. Beautiful location there. And when that's enlarged, as it is in the cover of my book, thanks to Caroline, I think it looks quite well. That was Doon House. Big loss to Broadford, demolished in the 1930s, huge mansion, the roof taken off because of raids. It was the seat of their family, easily traceable, the Butlers, because they were transplanted in the 17th century from Tipperary, Ormond country to Broadford. So the Butlers are very well documented. But the last of the Butlers left Doon 1821, and the family went to Castlecrane. So the Castlecrane papers in Dublin contains information on the Butlers. After that, it went through different ownership, including in 1900, Whitehead, Robert Whitehead, the inventor of the torpedo. So fabulous grounds still there today, outbuildings and so on, beautifully located close to the lake, the Butler House of Doon. House still standing, belonged to the Bentley family of Huddlestown in Broadford since the 1650s. The landed family died out in the 1950s when Digby Bentley died. Wonderful family of continuous service to the community, relatively small-sized, middle-sized landlords. You only have 3,000 acres or whatever, but relative to other landlords, that was just, they were residents. And their genealogy is very well tracked because in about 1901, Aubrey Bentley, one of the two brothers that unmarried that died off in Huddlestown, he drew up a family tree of the Bentleys, and I'm sure if the likes of Paddy was ever interested in getting a copy of that, I can supply same, because they were intermarried with lots of similarly sized families. 1880s, 1890s, photograph taken outside Huddlestown, one of the earliest photographs ever taken in the parish, and of a man who lived through the famine. Found at the site of the old, part of an old weapon, found at the site of the old barrack. There is again taken Huddlestown, the lady, and he who pays the rent, probably in her 90s, born around the period I'm talking about, 1800. That is Huddlestown today, even though it's now unoccupied. Another photograph of Violet Hill House, which I already mentioned, the goings. Then this is the lodge, built and still standing on the road from Broadford towards Scariff. Yet at that stage, in around 1900, it belonged to the Phelps family. I notice Freddie is on the Zoom call, Freddie Burke, and Freddie would be in Clonlara, would be very strong on all of the Clonlara connections, so I better be careful with my facts now. But Phelps, I think it was, they had a large house in, I think I'm going to say somewhere Hill, I'm being corrected even now, I'm sure. And they bought the lodge, they bought the lodge in Broadford around 1880, 1890. Beautiful house. It was only built as a shooting lodge by the man who was the wealthiest man in Ireland at that stage, Charles White. He also, you might be familiar with Luttrellstown Castle. That was his main residence. Other views of same. That was much of the hillside overlooking Broadford was a game preserve. And this is the game register of Broadford kept by the Phelps family when they were in occupation. They normally came to Broadford just for shoots. By far the biggest landlord family in the parish, and again very well documented, would be the Arthur family of Glenomra. Arthurs were one of the principal, if not the principal, merchant families in Limerick. If you take Arthur's Quay, Ellen Street, Catherine Street, all of Robert Street, they're all called after members of the Arthurs. They came out to Broadford Parish, Glenomra, which is Amber Valley, in the late 17th century. They built a number of houses. That house was their, maybe linking the strong house and the castle, and we'll say the more modernized house that was demolished in the 1920s. They had an estate of about 10,000 acres, very wealthy in relative terms compared to most of the landlord families, and consequently intermarried with the O'Briens of Dromoland and the Smiths of Carmyle and so on. Famous for their beautiful carriage, which wasn't quite so famous when this photograph was taken around 1890. And that was part of their estate, Glenagaliag, the mountain, much of that was part of the Glenormand estate, even though most of their estate was in the adjoining parish of Killaloo and also in Clonlara. Similar view. That was their Dublin house. I think it's now today owned by the OPW. So that'll give you an idea of their wealth, that their family were educated in Paris. And as I say, extremely wealthy family. Unfortunately, because of the illness of the heir, Thomas Hart, in the 1840s, it went into administration by the, fortunately and unfortunately. Unfortunately for Broadford, because there were good landlords, even though they weren't always resident landlords. The courts took over the management of the estate in the 1840s, and it was given to Ernest Brown of Clonby House. The only advantage of that is he had to keep meticulous records, and there was a fantastic series year after year that I'm sure no real local historian has ever looked at yet. Hopefully they will now shortly and don't be given out. And it's a listing of all the people who occupied it there at that time. In Ballymaloney, they were the tenants: Michael Maloney, John McHugh, Bat Skehan, Thomas Bolton, John Connell, Patrick Casey Jr., Patrick Casey Sr., and so on. That's a list of names that would not be recorded anywhere else. Now, in the 1940s, the Irish Manuscript Commission, or was it Edward McLysaght, went around to different houses, gathered up material, and when he came to Clonby, he got the papers from the arters. And I remember when I went doing my research, first of all in Dublin, looking through Hayes's manuscript sources, there was a single line saying Arter manuscript and a call number, and I sent off for it, and suddenly these huge metal boxes started arriving, you know, of deeds and leases and rentals. So I have gone through them very much for the 1800, 1830 to 1850 period. Others still remain to be sorted out. Again, other documentation, we'll say this one here was an agreement. This one was made by a member of a very influential family, the Stinsons. Stinson is a very unusual name. The Stinsons and the Shocknesses, or O'Shocknesses, were first cousins. And they gave Killaloo some of the greatest, or the most powerful priests the diocese ever had, including Dean Terns, who built, am I right, Ennis Cathedral, and Bishop O'Shocknessy. And all of his cousins, like the Stinsons and the O'Shocknesses, had most of the wealthy parishes. And meanwhile in Broadford, there was another powerful clique. There were in Kilban, you had Corbetts, Crotties, and Vahans. And they gave us the second Broadford bishop of the 19th century, and which is very unusual because most of our bishops in Killaloo diocese over the last 200 years were coming from Tipperary, or many of them, but two of them came from Broadford: Bishop James O'Shocknessy and Bishop Daniel Vaughan. So again, these are the type of documents you find within it. Just signed by Augustus Arter, committee chairman. Just a simple little document used as an example. So that is it. I have a lot more I could say, but I think I've covered a lot. If there's any questions, maybe you prefer to move on to questions now, or if there's any further, if you want me to continue on with further information, I can. Do you think maybe? Do we have any questions? Does anybody have? I just, before I come to that, there's one other thing that comes to mind to me. Broadford is a very rich folklore, and my work in the last while, I got a great opportunity of documenting that. High up on the hill here, on the left-hand side, you're looking there at the highest point, which we call Crag. The hillside is called Glenagaliag, the Glen of the Witch. But high up on the hill is the Enchanted Lake. Not an enormous lake, but it's a huge part of local folklore. And I think most Clare people that are still able to put a leg under them should try and walk that hill and view the Enchanted Lake. That is a place going back into Druidical times with a huge amount of folklore relating to it. And another strong story that survived in the oral language. And remember, again, I was born within 1954, pre-television, court, people coming in, telling stories of the Enchanted Lake and the Picatai Wee, the yellow-haired witch of Broadford. Just a community having its own documented story, and putting that down in writing is an exciting project. She was a girl who sat in a stone in beautiful haired temptress that sat in a stone on Drummond Hill and waylaid weary travelers coming out from the city loaded with gold, and eventually she was banished to an island in Doon Lake, Kimstone Island, where she was put making sugons out of sand, and every 7 years she reappeared. But I haven't seen her yet. But just after Halloween, just showing the power of school. My son's worked in this draft, and I think Angus in the school I think they're going to have more of the history at this stage than I have myself, because he's sharing the stories with them. And my 5-year-old granddaughter, just after Halloween night, says, "Pat," she says, "I was coming down from Drummond last night and I saw the Picatai Wee." You know what I mean? I said, I must have been looking in the wrong places. So again, I hadn't time to cover folklore. I hadn't time to cover all of the what they ate, the clothes and so on. But as you can imagine, times were tough. There were, times were, and there was very little complaining. And they seemed to me, very hard to judge retrospectively, they seemed to be very happy people, happy with what they had. Anyway, now Jane.
There's just 2 quick questions here. Now, one has asked, and I'd say, anyone here could answer this one, that's me. Is Doon Lake the lake of the same name near Ballinruan?
No, it's a different lake.
Okay. So this
and I think the butlers were also there in Crusheen, Ballinruan, and that can cause confusion. The butlers had such a large estate in Broadford, and it had so many sheep that somebody asked him one day, "How many sheep have you?" He says, "I can't count the number of shepherds I have, not to talk about the number of sheep." I don't know. They were a very well-off family.
Now, somebody else has asked, were the McDonalds of Broadford connected to the McDonald of Newhall outside Ennis?
Origination in Broadford, Diminy in Ballykelly, merchants remained in Broadford. You still have the family there, farming, a long continuity, but very much a Broadford family.
Okay. And I have a question here. This gentleman, Don McNamara, has the 3rd from the last screen of a deed. Did I see the name Thomas McNamara on it?
Would that be the one?
I'm not sure.
Well, if I go down below, this one is John Stinson of Gortacullen, and there's a James O'Brien in it.
Can I be a Catholic or church?
Catholic.
And Gortacullen was that in Broadford?
Yeah, Gortacullen. It's when you're going out of Broadford towards Limerick. Gortacullen is a lovely little valley. I don't know, there might be 2 families living there now, but a large number of families living there in previous times.
Is it below?
Sorry, it's to your right when you're leaving Broadford, going towards just outside the village.
Past her.
Just past Harlesdown. Up there, there's a little side road up there, up to Gortacullen. Yeah. That's it. The Gate Lodge still survives. It's used by the HSE. If you're coming out of Broadford Village, go on the past the church, Scariff Road, the HSE building is there, and the Gate Lodge is, the house is in, if you could imagine, back up in the hills on your left, elevated side, again, looking out over the lake. Gone as well.
So that's the road to Tulloch.
No, it's on the higher road on the way out. Again, a significant loss, and only a house that was demolished because, again, of the cost of maintenance.
Anybody else have any questions?
It comes to dealing with the order.
I certainly, that's what I've most of my time done. Yeah, I agreed. And if I have a minute, so I'll just, because I have a few bits here, but they were the ones I really would have meant to cover. But that was most of my takes, and I found that I was following the visuals. Take, for instance, care of the poor. A Mary Dial, I thought this summed up very well what people were doing, how they took care of their own in the early 19th century. She gave evidence to a commission, Mary Dial, a local girl, and she said, we give all who come, we give to all who come as long as we have anything. This is a time now with no social welfare, nothing. We give to all who come as long as we have anything. Sometimes when we are at dinner, 2 or 3 people will come. They sit down and take their share. Sometimes when they pass and look in, they get a handful of potatoes, and we would give more if we had it. A sick family, I'm saying, received a communal response as locals proceeded to congregate outside the door and give milk or potatoes or whatever else they had. Regarding clothes, James Maloney of Kiltannon House gave evidence to a commission, and he said local people in East Clare were generally very badly clothed. One visitor to the area claimed that for the Irish, the difficulty is how to get actually covered, how to generate enough clothes to cover the members of your family. The clothing, the men wore a frieze jacket spun at home. Men also wore a shirt and had a great coat made of frieze also. The clothing was coloured with the dyes obtained from wild plants, including alder, the roots of buckbean and elder. Most local people seldom, if ever, wore footwear during this era. Any shoes and boots that they wore were manufactured locally. In the Broadford, the school surveys of 1937 are magnificent. And we had a whole plethora of schools around, not just in Broadford, but the Glen, Sallybank, Kilrush, you know, the Clare you could draw from. One person contributing to the, speaking of boots and shoes in 1937, the school folklore service said, about 100 years ago, all the Irish boys and girls wore no boots until they were about 18 or 20 years of age. If they got a prod of a stone, it would have no effect on them. This was all due to their hard feet. They only wore boots going to mass on Sundays, and because boots got so little hardship, a pair would do for years. Small reference in their houses of the poorer people. Their houses were built of mud and thatched with straw or rushes. They were low and small, containing 1 room or 2 rooms and a kitchen, a door, and 2 small windows. The house was thatched with either rushes or heath. And that's interesting. In Broadford, they thatched the houses even though they had slate in the locality. And the reason is slate was a cash crop. They could sell the slate. They had no problem in getting thatch. And of huge importance were fires. All houses required a fire throughout the entire year. It provided heat for the house to dry their clothes, some light, and was also used for cooking. During the winter months, the fire was generally kept lighting both day and night. Before the last member of the house retired to bed at night, sods of turf were generally left kindling on the ash. It's not, you know, so the whole idea of the fire, of the flames, you can see the importance in the dark world in which maybe they lived. It was looked upon as unlucky to let the fire out. And again, as regards food, it was almost completely confined to potatoes, because 1 acre of potato was sufficient to rear a family, apart from the hungry months. And the blacksmith, consequently, was a very important person, making the iron gates, the ploughs, and the farm implements, because his forge was a meeting place. And many people attributed curative powers to the wash and the truck. Bogs, there was a huge number of bogs, most of which are now gone and dug out. So they had plenty, all they needed were potatoes and turf. And once they had those 2 requisites, they could rear large families. And that's what happened. And maybe a little bit, seeing that I'm on dealing with it, folk remedies. Within the folk survey, if you go back on the, for anybody interested in natural health or whatever, it's fascinating the number of folk remedies that those people knew of. How did they know them? How many generations of experimentation and so on did it take to find it out? So in October 1844, the Leeds Intelligencer paper, obviously copied from the Limerick Chronicle, because they didn't send somebody from Leeds over to Broadford, reported the death lately at Limerick Workhouse, aged 108 years, of Margaret Scully of Broadford, County Clare. Very unlikely anyone lived to be 108 then, because they'd have to be documenting her birth in the 18th century, which is unlikely. But again, she was of a great age. And what, just extract a small bit from it. To stop bleeding, they applied ribs of grass for a bad, and also for a bad bruise or cut. Bathing in hot water after boiling potatoes for stiffness and swellings. Nettles used for blistering, for pains in the back and chest. Also, nettles boiled in the water after boiling bacon and eaten in the spring for clearing the blood. Each member of the family got nettles to eat on the 3 Fridays in March. And the phrase going with it was, if they would eat nettles in March and drink mugwort in May, so many fine maidens would not be laid in the clay. Now, the following plants were used locally for medicinal purposes. Elderberries boiled and strained and bottled and taken for stomach troubles. Dandelion boiled in new milk, a cure for delicate child or anemic girls. I don't know what anemic buys. Lime water and sweet oil for burns. Cold tea was also good, and so on. Dwarf elder was used as a cure for murrain in cattle. So I'm only extracting a small number of the natural cures that the people had. And what I'm saying about the supernatural, there was also then the cure for the whooping cough was non-scientific in nature. The sufferer was asked to go under a grey mare 3 times and to drink ass's milk or any cure given by the driver of a grey mare. So obviously the grey mare in the locality had a huge importance. Another non-scientific cure was for people affected by whooping cough. The remedy was to take out the person who has the cough to a man with a white horse, and it would be cured. So in Broadford, there was an ancient site associated with fertility. In the townland of Crag, this person writing this, 1937, said, in the townland of Crag, there is a peculiarly shaped stone, which is known locally as the Druid's chair. This stone is shaped like a chair. It is 1.5 feet high and about 20 inches wide. Beside the chair, there's another stone which serves as a footstool. The chair has a back and side arms. This stone chair was used in previous times by women in childbirth to help them give birth. And I didn't cover mineral springs. A huge amount of mineral springs, what I suppose bad would likely Stunvarna, which survived famously. There were minerals, a lot of mineral springs where people went for medicinal water. So that's just some of what life was like. I've just maybe 1 or 2 more seen that we'd mentioned hurling, and I'll come to that. Okay, question in a moment. I just finished the importance of the fair day, the Killeans where the unbaptized children were buried. They're all there. Hurling was described in 1808 by Eli Hutton as injurious to the morals and industry of the younger classes. This wouldn't happen in the modern age now, but he's described. People too often adjourn to the whiskey house, men and women, and spend the night in drinking, dancing, and singing. Perhaps until morning, matches are often made between partners at the dance, but frequently happens that they do not wait for the priest's blessing, and the fair one must apply to the magistrate. Clonlara school survey described hurling matches between Broadford and Clonlara. Hurling home, they called the game, where the ball was thrown in halfway between both villages. The ball would be thrown in and the game would start over the ditches and hedges, through bogs and marshes, each team trying to bring the ball home, and an immense crowd of spectators cheering them on. It may take the whole summer to decide one of those matches, as night would fall before they would be home. When we play them now, normally it's hard to press to last the hour. But anyway, Irish language. The Irish language was spoken and began to die out in that period. And if you go into the census for Broadford 1901, you will find, as it happened in my mother's family, my mother's grandmother, was it, well, a great grandmother, living in Arskey in 1901. She was aged 83, mother-in-law to a large family, you know, in the house. I think there was 13 children and, you know, parents to 11 children and her. Of all the members in that did the return, she was the only one who could speak Irish and English, because she was born into a parish of Broadford, where Irish was the spoken language together with English. And the same thing applied for a lot of the census returns. The older people, anybody over the age of 75, were the only ones being marked in as able to speak Irish and English. Have you enough on the poor people now? Or are they? Okay, the middle class, yeah, there was. And you had a big farming class in Broadford as well. And they are the ones that give us our priests. You know, normally the members were educated, and they are the ones who survived the famine. There are the two Broughtons. That's right. Fabulous. Oh, and they certainly would, and they're hugely important. They were so important. But there's so many things in the parish of 22,000 acres, 8,000 people. You know, they were important, but they're almost important on a national scale. John O'Donovan and Eugene O'Cully were so important that it was I am nearly concentrating more on the local than the national, but they're not forgotten. Sorry, there was a question at the back. Yeah, it was the very same vein as Killaloo. It was used in Ennis courthouse. It was used in most of the churches in the county in the 19th century. You must remember that from 1850 on, it wasn't quarried anymore. And when they opened up the commercial quarries, they opened them up in Portrue, Killaloo slate, even though technically it's Tipperary. And the market for Broadford slate disappeared. I was looking recently on an article about the huge military barrack, in Crinkle outside Burr, roofed with Broadford slate. One of the greatest houses in the county, Mount Ivors. In the description of the building of Mount Ivors, they brought the slate from Broadford and the bricks from Holland. So Broadford slate would have been widely used. Yeah.
Did you come across any of the male population joining the British Army?
Yes. No, even back in the early 19th century, a number of people, you only find out about them incidentally. One returns, one gets a pension or whatever. But certainly, yes, not huge numbers, but there would have been, because of the military barracks in Limerick, you would have had an enlistment. But what really came in the latter part of the period was immigration, where people just got out.
I'm just amazed at the population at that time, 80,000, and you said 1,000. Possibly,
it's hard to judge now because when they do the census area, it doesn't correspond exactly with the parish area. Yeah, it's incredible. It had dropped to 4,000 within 2 years of the famine. Sorry, 1851. And there was a continual decline up until maybe the 1970s. And now it's on the up. It goes through cycles, I suppose.
So Pat, your book is going to be available. Can you just tell us before we go
Well, I'd say it'll be mostly, my family have taken over the distribution of it. They want to make sure there's copies for them. I'm not denying anyone a copy, but we're having a launching in Broadford on Sunday week, please God. And my boys are handling that. And hopefully, they're going to give the locals the opportunity of getting the book. And hopefully there'll be a few left over for people who are interested. I'm not too worried. It's not really commercial. No, if they really wanted, it's going to be, it's like the Munster final. The occasion is going to be the launching. I'm giving priority. They're giving priority to the people who come to make sure that they have a copy, because they have organised the day, the community, there'll be a cup of tea and a chat, and then I'll see what happens after that. Does that? That might make complete sense, but that's what I'm at. Okay. I'm not. It's not like the Late Show where I'm coming around to push a book. I don't. Yeah.
Well, listen. Thank you. Thank you very much, Pat. That was excellent talk.